Have you ever wondered what sparked the Vietnam War, a conflict that reshaped history? The roots of this monumental clash can be traced to the struggle for Vietnamese independence from French colonial rule. Post-World War II, Vietnam found itself divided into two halves, the North under communist control, and the South, staunchly anti-communist. The ideological chasm between the two halves was vast and deep. But it wasn't just ideology that fueled the fire. Nationalistic fervor and geopolitical interests stoked the flames, transforming the division into an all-out war. North Vietnam, led by the charismatic Ho Chi Minh and his communist Viet Minh, aspired to unify Vietnam under a single communist government. South Vietnam, on the other hand, backed by the United States, sought to maintain a non-communist government under leaders like Ngo Dinh Diem. So the stage was set for a conflict that would last 2 decades and leave an indelible mark on the world. But who were the main actors in this drama of war? Let's start with North Vietnam, officially known as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or DRV. At the helm was the charismatic Ho Chi Minh, a fervent nationalist and communist. His objective? To unify Vietnam under a single communist government, an ideology he believed would bring equality and progress to his people. On the other side of the 17th parallel, we find South Vietnam, or the Republic of Vietnam, RVN. This side was backed by the United States and was led by leaders like Ngo Dinh Diem. Their goal was to maintain a non-communist government, seeking to establish a Western-style democracy that they hoped would bring prosperity and freedom. These were the major players, each with their own vision for Vietnam, clashing in a conflict that was as much about ideology as it was about national identity. With these players in place, the Vietnam War was a complex game of power and ideology. What drove the United States to intervene in a war thousands of miles away? This question brings us to the heart of American involvement in the Vietnam War. The United States, emerging from World War II as a global superpower, found itself in a new kind of struggle, a Cold War against the spread of communism. This ideological battle stretched across continents and was particularly evident in Southeast Asia. The US policy of containment, aimed at limiting the spread of communism worldwide, played a critical role in the decision to support South Vietnam. The fear was that if Vietnam fell to communism, a domino effect would occur, toppling nations across Asia. But what escalated US involvement from mere support to active combat? The turning point was the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. North Vietnamese forces allegedly attacked 2 US naval destroyers patrolling international waters. Whether these attacks truly occurred has been a matter of debate, but their reported occurrence was enough to spur the US Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. With this green light, the United States escalated its military involvement in Vietnam. American troops were sent in droves, with peak deployment reaching over 500,000 by 1968. The US war machine was in full swing, deploying sophisticated weaponry and pouring billions of dollars into the conflict. It was a war of attrition, aimed at wearing down the enemy and bolstering the South Vietnamese government. Yet, the Vietnam War was not a conventional war. The dense jungles, unfamiliar terrain, and guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong presented unique challenges. Moreover, the ideological divide at home over the war's morality and purpose only added to the complexity of the American involvement. Thus, the US found itself deeply entangled in the Vietnam War, a conflict unlike any it had faced before. How did the war unfold on the battlefields and back home in America? The Vietnam War was a battle of not just firepower, but also of strategies, terrain, and public sentiment. In the dense jungles of Vietnam, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong turned to guerrilla warfare to counter the superior firepower of the US and South Vietnamese forces. They dug complex tunnel systems, set booby traps, and blended in with the civilian population. This was a war without front lines, where the enemy was often unseen until the moment of attack. For the US and South Vietnamese forces, this presented unique challenges. The dense jungle terrain was difficult to navigate, and the enemy was elusive. Cultural differences further complicated matters. The language barrier and unfamiliar customs often left American soldiers feeling like strangers in a strange land. The difficulty of distinguishing between civilians and combatants led to tragic mistakes and unintended casualties, further fueling anti-war sentiment back home. In America, the war was brought into living rooms through television screens. This was the first major conflict where the brutal realities of war were broadcast daily, often uncensored. Images of bloody battles, wounded soldiers, and devastated Vietnamese villages became a common sight. These images and the rising death toll sparked a wave of anti-war protests across the nation. College campuses became hotbeds of dissent, with students staging sit-ins, teach-ins, and marches. The war was not just being fought thousands of miles away, but also on the home front, in the streets of American cities and towns, and in the hearts and minds of the American people. Even popular music of the era reflected the nation's turmoil. Songs like Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival and Blowin' in the Wind by Bob Dylan echoed the frustrations and hopes of a generation questioning the morality and purpose of the war. The Vietnam War was a war of attrition, both on the ground and in the court of public opinion. This was a war where the line between friend and foe was blurred, and the battle was as much about winning hearts and minds as it was about military victories. Did you know there was a single event that shifted the tide of the Vietnam War? This event was the Tet Offensive, a massive attack launched by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong in 1968. In an audacious move, they attacked numerous South Vietnamese cities, including the capital, Saigon. While the Tet Offensive resulted in heavy losses for the communist forces, it had a profound psychological impact. The widespread assault challenged the optimistic narrative that the United States was winning the war. It exposed the grim reality of the conflict and eroded American public support. The media coverage of the Tet Offensive brought the brutality and complexity of the war into American living rooms, further fueling anti-war sentiment. This shift in public perception marked a significant turning point in the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive, while a military loss for the North, was a strategic victory, shaking American confidence and support for the war. How did the Vietnam War finally come to an end, and what were its lasting effects? This is a question that warrants a thorough exploration. By the early 70s, the United States, wearied by a war that seemed to have no end in sight, began pulling its troops out of Vietnam. This gradual withdrawal marked a significant shift in the dynamics of the conflict, as the American military presence had been a formidable force on the battleground. In January of 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. This agreement, while not solving all the problems, was a significant step in the right direction. It marked the official end of US military involvement in the Vietnam War. However, the war itself was far from over. 2 years later, in 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a decisive offensive. This culminated in the capture of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The fall of Saigon was a pivotal moment, signaling the end of the Vietnam War and the beginning of a unified Vietnam under communist rule. The aftermath of the Vietnam War was profound and far-reaching. It left a deep imprint on American society, prompting a reassessment of US foreign policy and military interventions. The war also led to an increased skepticism of government and the media, fueling a climate of distrust and disillusionment. The legacy of the Vietnam War extended beyond the borders of America and Vietnam. It sparked worldwide discussions about the ethics of war, the true costs of conflict, and the responsibility of powerful nations in global affairs. Moreover, the Vietnam War challenged traditional perceptions of power, revealing that superior military strength does not guarantee victory. The resilience of the North Vietnamese forces, despite their material disadvantages, underscored the power of determination, strategy, and ideological conviction. In conclusion, the Vietnam War was more than a conflict between two ideologies or a struggle for territorial control. It was a turning point in history, a war that altered the course of nations and reshaped the global landscape. The Vietnam War left a legacy of change, challenging perceptions of power, trust, and the very nature of conflict itself.